Hello, welcome to our first episode of UnHypnotized Conversations around the Mind and Money. I'm the host, Heather Keys, and I'm here with my occasional guest and host, Dave Bradley. Today, we are going to get into a topic called the Great Malaise. And we're coming off of the energy of the Bitcoin Rodeo, and there were so many of these conversations had on stage, off stage, on the sidelines about not just what's going on in our world, but how we're all really affected by it. And we'd like to bring more of that awareness and that conversation to you today. So, Dave, what do you think? Do you want to get started talking more about what is the Great Malaise?
Yeah, the Great Malaise is a term that I've coined for something that I think pretty much everyone can identify with these days. And it's been building for a while, but I think really has gotten a lot worse in the last 5 years, especially. And I remember having this conversation with my good friend Madex in, I want to say 2018, 2019, somewhere in there. And the conversation kind of came down to this idea that the world is just fucked. Like this shit's not right, and we can all kind of feel that. You know what I mean? Like incentives are not aligned, and things don't turn out the way that people expect them to and think that they should. And really, the results for our lives have been so negatively impacted in the last, especially 5 years, but really going back right to the 70s. You know, we've started to become disconnected between our actions and the outcome for our lives. This idea that you can work really hard and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and as long as you show up every day and work hard, that you're going to be successful is increasingly not true. You know, people are struggling to be able to get by, to be able to afford groceries, let alone buy a home these days. And really, that disconnect has started to weigh more heavily on everyone. And I would describe that as like this malaise where there's a lot of people in the world that are feeling really helpless, and they're feeling like they can't get out from under something, but they don't really know what that thing is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was just thinking about a conversation I had the other day with someone who has boomer parents and how that's still really this attitude of like, well, it must just be you, you must not be working hard enough, or, you must not be willing to pay your dues so that you can be successful. And that's when it becomes really transparent that, well, I mean, even that maybe was a bit of a lie in itself, but it was at least more possible to, work hard and create something for yourself than what you're saying is like now it's just increasingly more difficult. But what do you think is happening? Like, why would you call it a malaise? Like, what is that to you?
Well, I think it's a big phenomenon that is really sweeping across all of our society and all of our culture. It's not limited to financial or material success. It's starting to weigh on people in a really emotionally impactful way. And part of the reason for that is because it's crept into so many areas of our culture, right? Like there are massive elements of our culture, from pornography to the trans agenda, and all of these extreme elements of society that we're now almost forced to accept as normal. It all goes back to this feeling that this shit's just not right, that a lot of people share. And the voices that have spoken up until very recently, the voices that were speaking up against any of this cultural perversion, were essentially canceled, right? I wouldn't have honestly felt safe to even say this on a recording that I would put on the internet 3 years ago, because the consequences to speaking the truth to something like that can be very, very real. And this disconnect between our actions and our outcome has really misaligned every single incentive system in our society. to the point where there isn't really a proper feedback loop to be able to weed out the parts of culture or society that are broadly unacceptable to most people. And instead, what's become the feedback is that the parts of our culture that speak the loudest, that have the most lobbyists, that become more important as a special interest group to those in power, are the elements of culture that are disproportionately overrepresented at this point in a way that is really just not acceptable to most people. And, I don't think I'm alone in seeing this. And I don't think it, like I said before, I don't think it comes down to just the outcome for your life. It's also the fact that you can see, if you're a hardworking person, you're going to work every day, maybe you're running a small business, you can see that that is not the most effective way to gather wealth in today's world. The most effective way to gather wealth in today's world is to get yourself as close to the money spigot as possible, to get into the finance industry, to get into the lube industry, which is what I call, the mountains of consultants, accountants, and lawyers that work for Deloitte and every other firm like them, whose jobs are essentially to make it so that it's not quite as bad when the government fucks you. Those paths yield more financial success in the world that we're in today as compared to being a plumber, being a pipe fitter, doing something that's useful, doing something that someone else gains value from and pays you for your time for. And that is the disconnect that is weighing on all of us. And that's why I call it a malaise. That's why I think it's the Great Malaise.
I mean, I think of malaise in a similar way, but within. Because what I'm hearing when I hear you talk about this is that, right, it's like even those paths that seem more successful, or you can have like a greater financial success, there's still it's still an outside in approach to peace, contentment, to happiness, because like you said, it just like makes the hit hurt a little less because there's that certain level of comfort that maybe isn't afforded to those that are providing like services to the community that everybody needs. And something that I did hear often at the Bitcoin Rodeo too is people saying, nowadays, like you can't just have a job and that's your job and it funds your survival needs. Like you have to have another job, even if that second job is, well, now you've got to learn how to invest your money because your money isn't good if you're not investing it. And so that's like actually another job, never mind the job of raising our children and bringing, emotionally healthy people into the society. But when we're talking about this sort of underlying desperation or depression, or we could even call it a heaviness. When you say malaise, I think of like a fog. Like I think of like a heaviness that really is conducive to just wanting that hit of numbing dopamine in all the ways that are accessible to it in our society. And coming from my background in hypnosis, I always think about the very simple science of the mind, and we've got the conscious mind, the analytical, practical mind, and we've got the subconscious, which people would say is under the water, the iceberg under the water, and that's like 90% of our feelings, thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs. And, what's so interesting is the law of the subconscious mind is such that the dominant idea is always accepted by the subconscious mind and then is creating reality. And so to me, what I feel is going on is like people just have a desire to be hopeful. And like we want to believe like that we can thrive and survive and like working hard and caring matters. But when like you said, when there's a disconnect between our actions and efforts and our reward, it just starts to weigh on us. It starts to really hit at that subconscious level. And so we could say all the affirmations that we want to, but at the end of the day, if we're not really willing to kind of face that reality, we're sort of just trying to lie to ourselves to be happy.
Yeah, and I think one way that you could look at it is that this malaise has kind of infected the subconscious mind, right? Because there should be this idea that, I provide 1 unit of value and I get 1 unit of value back, that I think is pretty fundamental, at least in concept, to the really the idea of like commerce in general, right? Is this idea of exchange of value for value. And what has been drilled into us our whole lives and has essentially taken up a larger and larger percentage of the part of your subconscious mind that deals with value and that deals with consequences. And the more they push this idea that, value for value shouldn't be exchanged directly, there should be some other party that also gets some of the value simply by the fact that they exist. They get some of the value from our commerce, right? And that stems from this this underlying belief that they know how to spend that value better than the individual does. And as that premise has been pushed further and further, that the governments of the world can harvest value from our money by printing more while we're holding it, that takes up a bigger and bigger portion of the mind. And that, I feel, is part of what is weighing on everyone is when I describe it as of like shit's just not right, that's the part that's not right.
Yeah, and you're right, because a big part of that underlying or that unconscious malaise is also fundamentally a betrayal of trust. Like once we are, once our innocence is gone and we got hurt by something that we really, someone, some organization that we thought really had our best interest at heart, that betrayal, like that trust is eroded. And then we see everything through the lens of that distrust, which is healthy to have that distrust, but it's also really disheartening. And, I did have this thought today because I was thinking about how many people owe taxes to the government. And I was thinking today, I'm like, the government really has no idea about how to use the law of attraction. Like, it probably is stressful for them too, that they have all this money owed to them. But what they really don't get is like, they don't get that if they like made it, and I know this is like a pipe dream, but I'm just gonna say it because I think it's funny. Because like if they really knew how to use the law of attraction, they would realize like, there wouldn't be so much resistance from people wanting to talk to them or pay because we would feel like it's actually contributing to a society that we want. And so like their whole model is faulty because people imagine a society where people actually were just like feeling good about contributing part of their earnings because it actually went to things that we wanted to see more of, which as we know isn't the case. And I think a large part of this malaise that we're speaking to today.
Yeah. And the fact is that not only is that view of value not there, and it's no surprise that the government's bad at creating that that impression that they're providing value because they're bad at everything. But not only are they not providing value, in most cases they're actually going in the opposite direction these days. And so I've been sitting here drinking my my raw milk White Russian, and this stuff, the raw milk, was purchased illegally from a farmer who I can't name because this stuff is literally harder to get than cocaine. And it's absurd in the first place. The cocaine is illegal, let alone milk, right? Like the government, their priorities are so backward that they've banned unapproved milk. Like, it blows the mind that there is a serious discussion about whether or not I should be allowed to drink milk. That's so far beyond absurd. And not only are they overstepping their bounds in terms of trying to make decisions for me and controlling my life by saying whether or not I can drink milk, they're making me pay for them to do that. And so there is this massive disconnect where not only are people not seeing that the actions that they take don't yield the outcomes that they expected, they're not achieving the kind of success that they expect based on the path they were told to expect. It's got to be very disheartening if you're like a family doctor and you see your friend from high school who went on a similar educational path and got himself an MBA and now does something entirely useless and makes 4 times more money at the end of the day than you. And that big disconnect wherein the people who have learned to work hard and who do something useful see those around them who have, instead of learning to do something useful, just position themselves in a spot in society that gets them closer to where all the free money is pouring into the economy. They see that that's the best path to success. If you really want financial freedom, you go down that path. And that path has its own set of perils for the mind and the soul, really, right? Where, those people working at Deloitte, sitting in their cubicles, moving numbers around so that the government gets slightly less in the way of a small business that does something real. Like, at the core, they know that that's not useful. They know that that's not real, right? And it's very difficult to be fulfilled in the world when you are essentially siphoning value away from the world. And I think you mentioned some of it before, where a lot of us are kind of like pretending to be happy or tricking ourselves into being happy. But for those people, the Great Malaise is still there. It's still lingering in the same way. And if anything, it's harder for them to understand because in a lot of ways they've had financial success that, they've got $300,000 worth of financed cars and a very nice house. Not everyone sees that as happiness, I guess. And it can be an empty life for people, even if they achieve financial success. And I think part of the reason for that is because the Great Malaise is taking up a bigger and bigger portion of people's time, of people's worries, and of people's mind.
I mean, I really hope, and like it is my desire through the course of hosting this series that I become as fearless as you to say whatever the fuck is on my mind, and I really applaud that. And it's been something I've been really enjoying getting to know you. And what you're speaking to is it because what I learned, from having so many clients over the years, and I will say that sometimes I forget that, oh, right, like the majority of our people, our humanity is still in the dark of this. Because for me, I went there, I did that path, I did what I thought was like a successful business and then realized how hopeless it was in the model that it was like for there to be a real lasting reward for time and effort and even value, like the value that I brought to people's lives and the healing, and how that was just there's just too bad you got to still keep doing it. And what I learned from so many clients, and even now, just like that malaise that people are feeling in those careers, that a lot of people really just did genuinely choose to help people or to be of service because they do feel called to like serve a purpose and like give back and like nurture people and care for people. And how, like you said, if you're not playing that game and like getting closer to that spigot, then it's really just a fast track to burnout. And then not even that, even those people, like I can't even tell you how many clients I had come in and say, Heather, I have it all. Like I should be happy. I should feel happy. And I do think that that's the major shift that we're in from the time when it was enough, or it was okay to just work hard and build something. Now I think because of like the need for our world for people to show up, I think that it isn't anymore like that. Like if you're not living purposefully, and if you're not like intentionally contributing to society in a way that you could feel is actually going to make a difference, which is really hard to do, then that's super depressing. That's super depressing.
So how many episodes do you think you're going to need to solve this?
Well, I was thinking about like the financial complex, the medical industrial complex. That could be like a whole series. But then I was thinking about like, yeah, the purpose-driven people. And then I was thinking about the people that like are in that middle, because like it's hard to face. Like, and that's what I really like about this conversation is that we're not telling anybody how to think. We're not saying that we have all the answers. We're just saying like, let's take some topics and point to them and look at how our lives are being affected. So I mean, this could be potentially forever.
Forever it is.
But one thing that I think is that like it's not a solution, but it is something to start, a place to start, which is just like being willing to see, because that's my favorite thing still about this space of say relaxing the mind, like hypnosis. Because at least if we get out of this sort of like fear, anxious kind of like, just at least we can just be willing to see the malaise and even feel it for ourselves, because if we can be willing to see and understand that it's not, you and I talked about this too in the intro video and in our conversations of how, like, in our era of self-improvement, while we can always grow, I think it's also been it also is part of the Great Malaise because people have been made to think that they're the problem. And I think that's the first step. The first step is just being aware of how we're actually feeling about the state of our system and our lives, but then also being very cautious about taking it on yourself and thinking, okay, well, if I could just be more motivated or procrastinate less or like eat better or be stronger. And there's all this like programming around, well, it must be you because other people are successful in this, or your parents, they were able to, it must be your ADHD, or it must be your lack of ambition. And I think that's where we're going to find some like just settling into potential real solutions, because we're not falling into this again fear-based thinking that like there's something wrong with you and that's why you can't get ahead in this world.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been learning about money a lot for like the last 14 years, really. And this particular journey that I think we're talking about on this show, I kind of started on, like I mentioned, we were discussing it a little bit in 2018, 2019, but hadn't really identified anything yet, I don't think, and hadn't really thought about it in a structured way. But at the start of 2020, just as COVID was first starting its marketing campaign, I read the book Atlas Shrugged, which I had read in high school, but didn't really quite get back then. And I read it again now, and it's a very cautionary tale about where the kinds of choices that are being made in the world can take us. It's about the dangers and the evils of collectivism, and what that can do to a society, and how that can really twist the world. And I saw so many parallels between what was happening in that book, which was written in the 50s, and what was happening in the real world. And I was like honestly depressed after reading that book. And I then read another book by coincidence right after it called The Sovereign Individual, which I would recommend everyone read. And that book left me feeling a lot better. I was like, okay, I think we're going to be fine. And one of the things that it pointed to is a change in the way that money is created and distributed. And I think that's part of what we can get into with this series is like, I feel like I've just scratched the surface of this stuff, and I've started down the path of thinking about it. And to your point, I do think that I've started to see the malaise, but I definitely don't know that I have the answers to the malaise yet, other than the financial side potentially. But I think that I'm confident there is a path through the malaise, at least now that we've identified it. So I hope we can get there at some point.
Oh, that's where we're going, because each of these topics and each of these like feelings, like I often say, the way to is through. And so you always get to the light by going through the dark. And essentially, we're going through the dark, but as we go through the dark, the light emerges. And our innate wisdom ultimately becomes the guide for the path to the future. And one thing I will say is like, when you were talking about those books and like what you saw, and then especially now that like, well, 2020 is perfect vision. So it just made everything real crystal clear for many of us, and which is great. And that's also going to be one topic that I'll get into, which is like why so many people are experiencing inflammation and autoimmune diseases, because that's a natural symptom of injustice. And so as we go through these doors of information and awareness, I think it's always really helpful to remember in terms of the collective consciousness. So one of my ways that I wake up and feel like, oh, we're going through this and we're getting somewhere is because, well, one, the like just like any spiritual internal journey, the belief systems that are no longer working have to die in order for the phoenix to rise from the ashes. And I truly believe that we are in a time of destruction. And it is part of why we can sometimes just dance a little on the ashes, because essentially the things that aren't working for the abundance of all do have to die. And, maybe we'll see it in our lifetime or not. But I think that the biggest energetic movement, which is what brought me to this conversation, is money, and is the absolute necessary shift for how we use money. And especially if we want our civilization to be like that in the past that did survive, we've got to change the way that we exchange value, because the way that we exchange value right now is no longer in alignment with our risen consciousness.
Yeah, it's crossed the line, and
Yeah.
it's gone too far.
Yeah. Like, that's the most depressing part for me is like, it used to be so much easier to use the law of attraction to attract money than it is now, because there's like a part of us that knows that that doesn't even have value. So that can't even be true abundance.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's taking up a bigger and bigger part of our world. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's why I feel like that it's a lot easier to say things openly now than it was 3-4 years ago, because with COVID and on all the nonsense that we've seen since then, a lot more people are kind of awakened to this idea that there's a severe underlying problem in our current system. And in a lot of ways, the powers that be are redirecting that feeling and pitting both sides against each other, where you've got the left wing who feels like their lives are not working out because they're being subjugated by the patriarchy and institutional racism and all these factors that make life not fair for them. And then on the right, you've got a giant group of people that feel like their jobs are being stolen by immigrants, and the mainstream media is really the only problem out there, and the left wing politicians, right? And so they very effectively targeted a lot of that anger that people very rightly have about the state of the world, and are essentially directing it back at the other actors in the political establishment that really are just set up as like a counterpoint to have something to argue about, because what they're really arguing about is just nothing more than how to spend the money that they steal. So it's
it's interesting because when you say that, I think the ego loves separation. The ego loves separation because keeping separate is safe. And then we don't have to be vulnerable or feel things or face things, but then we also don't have love and connection and unity. And, I think of it as the ego loves separation, but also evil loves separation. And whenever we're playing into that division, it's all, and then like you said, it becomes like then people have something to blame for their pain. And while it is actually a higher vibration, it's a higher vibration to blame others for our pain than ourselves. We're still in the low vibration emotions here. So even though it actually feels better to blame someone else, which is why that's so effective, to give people like something to blame for their pain. It's, again, we have to remember that's like still a real lower vibration type of energy. And moving up the scale, which might be a nice episode too, but like moving up the scale, we could start to see how even just contentment is a higher vibration, or just acceptance. But then we can start to move into hope and love and unity. And so that's definitely something that I see as essential to our willingness to thrive instead of just keep surviving, which is just being, again, willing to see the ways that even people probably in our own community and families try to divide us, and just not play that game.
Well, it sounds like we're on the right track. I think all of this is solvable.
The great solution.
Yeah. Do we have I think we have some things to shill before we wrap it up. You can find me on pretty much everything as Bitcoin Brains. I'm, of course, the strongest and best looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada. And you can find more information about that on bitcoinbrains.com.
And yeah, we would love to, hear any thoughts. Please share in the comments. I'll definitely be looking in to see what you guys are thinking about all of this, because it's a fascinating topic. And and please like, subscribe, and you can find me on my new X account, which is UnHypnotized BTC. And yeah, we really look forward to continuing this conversation. And the last thing I'll say is, like, the reason that we did call this UnHypnotized is what we are looking at is just like relieving ourselves of like the beliefs and the veils and the perspectives, and essentially unlearn so that we can be open to the solutions that are going to present itself to us. Because the old adage is that there is a solution for every problem, or every problem has its solution. So thank you very much. Thanks, Dave, so much for getting us started on our first episode. And until the next one.